welcome to Healing Solidarity. If this is your first conversation you're listening to, and if it's one of many, then welcome back. Excited today to be here with Weh Yeoh. And I'm going to ask you, Weh, just to share with people a bit about who you are, what you do in the world. Yeah.
Thanks, Mary Ann. Yeah, well, I'm based in Australia, as you might be able to tell from my accent, but I have lived and worked in mostly Asia for 8 years. My background is a physiotherapist, and I also studied international development, but I became really passionate about helping people in less developed countries and disadvantaged communities when I was really young. Part of that is because I came from a family that migrated multiple times to give people like me and my, future progeny a better life. So really aware of that sacrifice that happened intergenerationally. And then being born in Australia, one of the most lucky countries in the world. So combined with that knowledge of sacrifice, I have this extreme privilege. I should also mention I'm the youngest of three, and youngest kids, let's face it, always do get the better deal. So I've had the most privilege out of all my siblings. And I've always been aware, I guess, of the fact that I'm very lucky. Having lived in Asia and spent time there, I guess I got a really good sense of power dynamics as well. And I started to question a little bit about how to use my own power in a way to help better, and also to make sure that I had the knowledge to be able to help. In Cambodia, I started a charity called OIC Cambodia that's helping develop the profession of speech therapy, where in the country there are none. There's also another enterprise called Happy Kids Clinic, which is a social enterprise that helps in tandem with the charity, but also gives 100% of its profit to that charity. And then now in Australia, I'm working on a social enterprise called UMBO. And UMBO helps kids, mostly in rural Australia, with access to health services online, where we cut wait times down from up to 18 months to hopefully a week.
Great. Thanks for telling us a bit about who you are and what you do in the world. And you have a TED Talk, and I think it'd be good to revisit it. I know you recorded it a little while ago, but you talk a lot there about the need for international organizations, international NGOs to think about redundancy. And I think it's an interesting topic to explore, because what came up for me when I was listening to it was like, can particularly large international NGOs, like, are they made to think about that? Is there a way to get them to think like that? And I don't know where you're thinking.
Well, it's a really interesting topic to talk about with people that have no connection to charities or international development, because the number one bit of feedback that I get when we bring it up is, oh, I thought all charities do that. And my response is actually virtually none do.
Yeah.
And you raise the topic of big charities, and it's certainly harder. I'm not sure if the goal for big charities is to make themselves fully redundant and close down. It's more about the mindset, I think, that they bring to the work. Mm-hmm. And fundamentally, what sits underneath all of this is, what is success for us? What does success actually mean? I think that's the fundamental question here. I've always found it very strange when charities talk about success in terms of growth. We've seen those statistics and bits on the website that say things like, we've raised 100 million this year, and last year we only raised 75, or we're now in another 5 different countries compared to 5 years ago. This to me is not necessarily a sign of success. It's a sign of doing a lot, and that is a form of success in helping people. But true success for me is actually not being needed. And I mentioned before, my background is a physiotherapist. So I guess I use this analogy in learning from that experience, where as a physiotherapist, you've done your job when the patient walks out of your clinic and never comes back in again, or hopefully doesn't come back in for a number of years, right? It's not seeing that patient week on week. That's revenue stream, but it's not actually success. So my point is that I would love to see charities more in that mindset, where they measure success by making themselves redundant and also handing off their work to local people to run. So I think redundancy is 2 things. For me, it's the leadership makes themselves redundant. In my sense, I'm a founder of a charity in Cambodia. It's entirely inappropriate, I believe, for me as a foreigner to remain a founder. And those organizations in Cambodia are run by Cambodian women. And the second thing is that the actual charity itself has an end date. So it says by 2030, we'll shut this charity down because we'll have achieved a certain KPI that means that it's sustainable. The project is sustainable after that.
Right. Yeah. And I recall writing an essay when I was at university 20 something years ago that where basically the point was international NGOs should be trying to make themselves redundant. So it feels
There you
like,
go.
you know, in different language, but basically that was the point. Like they, you know, they need to be doing themselves out of the job. I think that's how I put it. And yet we don't see that, right? And yet that's not, you know, and instead we count, and I know you said this in your TED Talk, you know, we count by these outputs, like, you know, a child, you know, a bit like the physiotherapy, we count by the sessions rather than the impact, the longer term impact. And even when we try to count longer term impact, somehow that isn't married up usually with what you're talking about, and there's an end date and we're going to stop when we get to a certain place. How did you identify the place that you would be your end date? Because there's always going to be more change that's needed in the world potentially, right?
Yeah, that's a good question, how to do it in practice. And when I talk to some NGOs about this, they do say, yeah, we really do believe in the concept, but they often say, yeah, we are making ourselves redundant. And then I run through, okay, well, what does that mean? And I believe that that goal at the end should be a SMART goal. And the key thing that they usually miss is the T factor, the time focus. Like, where is that actual end date? So I think it is the hardest thing to do. Pardon me. For us in Cambodia, it was a logical date because it was more about the number of clinicians that we could create. So the situation is no speech therapists in Cambodia at the moment. There are 0, and yet the need is over 500,000. So we know that to reach full coverage of the country, we need over 6,000 speech therapists. That's an end date that's well beyond my lifetime and my kids' lifetime. So we talk about an end date where we have 100. And 100 is nowhere near enough. It's not close to full capacity. And as you mentioned, Mary Ann, there's much more to do beyond that. But what we're saying is to get from 0 to 100 and making sure that these 100 are employed by the government and that all these things sit around it to make sure that it propagates. So things like awareness and demand and university courses and evidence base and professional bodies. That means that it will continue to thrive, continue to grow, and then eventually it will get to that 6,000 plus or whatever that number is at that particular time. And we're not needed anymore. So for us, it was the earliest possible point at which we felt that we could get out and it would still survive. Of course, I think fundamentally what lies underneath a lot of this stuff is our own attachment. I think that's kind of one of the key things here. And as a founder, you know, you're very attached to your project and there's a lot of ego involved in any sector, but helping people no more than any sector. I think it's probably as high as any sector. So when we talk about making ourselves redundant, what is really conflicting there is this loss of ego or loss of identity. You know, we talk about, I remember this moment when I was working in Cambodia where I was flying back to Australia at one point, and in my head, I was running through how I would introduce myself to a fellow passenger. Mm-hmm. And I think I was running through like, oh, am I a founder or am I aid worker? Am I a development worker? And then after a while, I started noticing that I was running through labels. Yeah. And I caught myself thinking this, and I'm like, what does it matter? Who cares? You know, and so I think there was a moment for me to kind of self-reflect and realize that I had taken on that identity to be something really important, but actually it didn't really matter.
Right. And what I like about the way you defined your end date is that it's very clear that that's a step on a longer road, and you're not trying to say that you will achieve the end of the longer road. And I think a lot of international charities, when you look at their kind of vision and their end goals in the kind of huge projects they develop, they're actually that much further end goal, as if they're going to be needed all the way through, right? It's like creating a job.
Exactly. And the problem with that is that it assumes that other people can do what you do.
Yeah.
which is a very, you know, and it's very topical for this event, because it's a very colonial point of view. It's a fundamentally very limited and possibly racist view, depending on, you know, what it is. But we have to start to give up our need to control. I think that's one of the other things as well, that a lot of this is really about control and trust, and being able to be okay with the fact that things might happen not necessarily in the way that we would have done it, but as long as it gets done, that's the most important thing.
Right.
You know, so again, I mentioned that we have these two wonderful Cambodian women running the two institutions that we created in Cambodia, and most of the boards are Cambodian, etc. The leadership's Cambodian. And there are times when they make decisions and do certain things where I look at that, and with my own cultural bias, I go, oh, I'm not sure about that. But it's an internal battle. And what I've learned, I guess, over the time is to worry less about the procedure and just worry more about the result. You know, I don't, because otherwise it gets back to that idea that I think I know better, which is very questionable. I'm just going to move out of the sun here. This is a bit of a,
sure.
We'll do a bit of a shift. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Like in my experience, this idea that I know better is actually it's actually deeply personal, reflective work, trying to let it go, because it still comes up, right? You know, and it probably comes up even, you know, for people that aren't working in this sector, like, you know, it's conditioned into us in a way that, like, that's our, you know, that's how we're useful in the world, maybe, like by saying, oh no, have you thought about this? You know, that can still be, however politely you say it, can still be internally you thinking, that's a silly idea, let me, you know, let me tell them the right way to do it, right?
Yeah. And of course we have great technical knowledge in a particular area, and we come from, you know, sometimes some great universities and have some great teachers, and we shouldn't downplay that at all. But I do think it is important to be able to admit that you don't know a lot of things. I've had experiences in Cambodia where people have come in with really great intentions and a lot of education, but they struggle because they really struggle to separate that from the fact that they've never worked in Cambodia, they've never worked in international development, maybe they've never worked in charity. So admitting what you don't know, to me, that is a real sign of wisdom.
Right. And I think a lot about the ways that we, you know, that we don't value lived experience, you know, community knowledge, other kinds of knowledge. And it's like, yeah, we might have technical skills and they might be a part of the story, but what are all these other knowledges and experiences that are just not valued enough in our sector, and how can we kind of bring those more to the fore, right? Because if I, you know, I'm sure you know this from your work too, but like that local knowledge, lived experience of the problem is going to be way more valuable than, you know, a bit of some technical skill that I might have learned somewhere. And if we can't, you know, so if we can't be open to that, I think we always run the risk of perpetuating your hamster wheel. I want to talk about the hamster wheel because I think it's such a good
Sure.
I think it's such a good way of putting it. So maybe you could just describe
that well,
people listening.
Sure. For me, the hamster wheel is the idea that is based on reality for me, where my experience was I worked in China with a big international charity, and I came in the 5th year of a 5-year program. And my role, in essence, was to make it look like they did what they said they were going to do, with the aim of getting more money coming into the next funding cycle. And the interesting thing about the situation was that actually what they did or were doing was not that effective. And yet they felt almost an entitlement, I think, to get more money because they felt that they were the best people for the job. And I think also there's a certain element of that when you're helping people. One of my most hated phrases of all time when it comes to charities, you know, when you talk to people that you say, I work in a charity or whatever, I'm not sure what it's like in the UK or other parts of the world, but in Australia, we get this reply, which is very commonly, oh, it's for a good cause. You know, or if you ask someone for money for fundraising purposes, they go, oh, it's for a good cause. And I hate that phrase. I hate it because it takes away all of the nuance all of the education, all of the critical thinking about what
Yeah.
constitutes a good cause, what makes it good, I mean, what makes you good at your job. So it's a good cause is something people say to sort of justify why you should do something, give money, etc., volunteer. So the hamster wheel really is this idea that charities are often set up to repeat, to rinse and repeat and keep going. Next funding cycle, we'll get more money. We'll do our reports and we'll do our M&E to justify money and keep on going. And the problem with that is that it never ends, really. There's no real kind of clear end date. And as I mentioned before, I think success is really when it hits that end point and we are fully redundant, and the community, the country, whatever it is that we're working with, they're able to carry it on by themselves.
Yeah, so then the success is like, we're not needed anymore. So I'm thinking that, from a personal point of view, as well as an organizational point of view, in order to, the theme of this conference is welcoming change. And in order to welcome that as an end goal, in order to be ready for redundancy to be success and not being needed to be welcome, what do we need to do personally and then organizationally just to allow that?
Yeah. It's a really great question, and it's not easy to do, I'll admit. And I noticed that as a founder, my happiness and temperament was very tied to the success of the organization that I'd founded, which of course is normal, but I think you want to minimize that as much as possible. So one of the things that I did was to try and disassociate my ego and identity from that organization. So to stop thinking of myself as the founder of OIC Cambodia, but to start thinking of myself as a person with a job, and also develop other interests beyond that. Yeah. And there was a real tipping point for me where I was in Cambodia and I'm very close with my family, and I forgot my niece's birthday. It just completely bypassed me. And it was a wake-up call for me to kind of go, all right, I'm helping all these people in Cambodia. If I can't be of help to people that are dear to me and around me, what good am I? So that was really important for me to then kind of rebalance it. So I think letting go of the identity and ego and creating other interests and other sources and forms of identity is really important at a personal level. Obviously, in terms of values, to be able to demonstrate the right kinds of values that would help you to give up and trust people. So things like humility, admitting that you don't understand everything, knowing how much you don't know, and just being really frank and open about that, and trust. And I think at an organizational level, it's much of the same thing, but it's amplified at a bigger level, right? So to be able to say that we'll be okay, we'll be okay if we stop working in this country or if we stop doing this project, because you know what, there are so many problems around the world to fix, to address, that it doesn't matter that one of our projects shuts down or this charity in this area shuts down.
Right. And I think it makes me think also of what we were talking about before we came on around, the practical ways in which we can seed power in ourselves, in our work, like what that actually looks like. Because if we're thinking about letting go of perhaps our ego, but also maybe our privilege and the things that might make us feel comfortable. What have you learned about that and also in your work?
Yeah, well, power, I use the word power a lot. I teach at university, and these development studies, or people that are interested in charities at least, we often talk about power and being aware of power dynamics. And I think when you're in the helping sector or you want to help people, it's very easy to lose sight of the power that you have. But the most effective way to actually help is to seed your own power, is to give up a seat that is probably better taken by someone else. It's the hardest thing to do, but it is probably the most effective thing. So there are some very simple examples. I remember a statistic that says when you open the floor to questions at a conference or an event, if the first person to ask a question is a man, the rest of the men are 2.5 times more likely to ask questions compared to women. However, the first question asker is a woman, it's quite even in terms of the genders. So very simple thing I learned from that is, even though I'm an eager beaver and always interested in asking questions, just shut up. Sometimes shutting up is part of the solution. Funnily enough, it's as simple as that. And then I think, in terms of philanthropic organizations, boards of those organizations, management teams of charities and boards, and people in those positions of power, if they're full of the same types of people, i.e. they lack gender, cultural diversity, LGBTQI, disability, socioeconomic, all of the different forms of diversity, then actually you're not really helping. I believe what you're really doing is you're maintaining the status quo because you're keeping yourself in a position of power and you're not allowing other people to come in and be part of that conversation. I'll just relate one very quick story. A couple of weeks ago, I was talking to someone who's now becoming an advisor for one of the things that I'm working on at the moment. And we met a couple of times, and he's a white male, very nice guy. And in the conversation where I asked him to come on and help, I mentioned to him that I felt from our conversations, limited interaction, that he was the kind of person who was really aware of power dynamics, and he didn't mind using his own privilege and power that he was born with to open doors for people who don't necessarily have access. And when I asked this question, it just became really apparent to me that it could have gone one of either two ways. He could have really gone, what power, what privilege, what are you talking about? I've worked really hard to get here, for example. But fortunately, he went the other way. And he said, I'm just so flattered that you picked that up. And I am absolutely 100% on board with that idea. I don't talk about it a lot in a professional sense, but I really do believe that part of my role in who I am and the privilege that I was born with is to actually help open doors and give other people a voice and a chance. And so I think that's really great. And the lesson that I learned is that when you say it like it is and how you believe it and speak to it directly, yeah, sure, he can turn around and berate me and say that he's very insulted, but we probably won't really have much of a working relationship if he did anyway, right? So
yeah,
when I say it,
something.
yeah, exactly. We've learned that we don't work well together, but when I say it for what I believe it really is, he's going to come to us with an extra ounce of energy and passion. So I think part of our role is to be able to talk about it, which is what this is really great for.
Yeah, and actually by naming it, even if he's saying, he doesn't normally name it, by naming it, you're making it visible in a way that means that also, if it wasn't happening for any reason, you could address it, right? So it's actually, I think, a win-win. And if he'd said, oh, you'd have been like, okay, maybe you're not the person that I want to invite into this work. So,
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. And I think from my personal experience, I'm privileged. So I talk about in Cambodia when I was living and working there, and I was the director of this charity that I started, and how funny it was to me that people would listen to me on the basis of a few things. So I'd kind of list them. Reasons why people listen to Weh. I'm the founder.
Mm-hmm.
I'm their boss potentially. I am male.
Yeah.
I'm tall, which in Cambodia is not a hard thing to do, but I actually am reasonably tall anyway. And then I'm a foreigner.
Yeah.
So you list these 5 qualities of me as a person. None of these things are reasons to believe me or listen to me. Yeah. And so the danger is that if I'm leading a team and they're following on the basis of that, or they're taking my advice on the basis of that, it's incorrect advice. And I start to lead them down a pathway that's not the right path. So I think it's really important that the leader is, in this particular example, is someone who's Cambodian. Mm-hmm. And then it's even better if we can happen to find a female, because in a country where women are not given leadership opportunities generally, more so than, let's say, the UK or Australia, those people tend to be extra grounded in reality.
Right. I want to ask a final question that maybe is a bit challenging, and I don't know let's see.
Yeah.
So given all that we've talked about around power dynamics, around who should be in leadership, around ceding power, like, if you had your time again, would you still found an organization that worked in another country trying to create change?
It's a great question. I love this question. And I think the irony of this question of the situation is not lost on me, that I talk about charities being redundant, and yet I founded charities, in Cambodia and now in Australia. And the situation was, at the time, I spent over 1 year, and I actually have logged 500 conversations about what can we do about the situation. 1 in 25 people needed this therapy, and no one was able to deliver it. Who was university trained, skilled to the right level. And it was incredible to me, because that means that over 500,000 people potentially can't go to school if they can't communicate. They can't get work opportunities. There's also people, and a large percentage of them have issues with swallowing. So if they can't swallow properly, food and liquid will go into the lungs, they get pneumonia and they die. So to me, it was unbelievable that tens of thousands of people were dying every year, potentially, because of a lack of this profession. Yeah. So I put this case forward to so many organizations, big and small, usual suspects who you might imagine I should be talking to, and there was nothing. Mm-hmm. And then I realized that I'll say from the outset, I never had any intention to start anything in my life. It just happened to be, there was no other way. Mm-hmm. But the first thing that we did was I tried to start the project as part of another existing local Cambodian organization to sit underneath them. And then that was kind of my workaround to say, oh, well, I didn't start a charity. And the logic was also it'd be easier to fold that project once it was done.
Yeah.
But then we came against some fairly obvious, probably, barriers around lack of control, lack of autonomy, lack of identity. And that really hampered us in our ability to get resources or to do anything or to have clout when we wanted to meet with the Cambodian government. So there really wasn't any other way. But when I started it, I didn't know this very specific end date that I stated before, 100 therapists in the Cambodian public sector by 2030. That took about a year. But I did have two principles. One of them was to have an end date and an end goal of some kind. And eventually I had people that were smart enough to help me to develop it. But the other thing was that it had to be led by a Cambodian person. And from start to that particular point where I left as a leader was 4 years, which I think in the big scheme of things is relatively fast. It was probably a little bit too early in retrospect. It wasn't quite ready to hand off, but I'd set the time frame. I'd already pushed it back once, I think, and then I decided, I had to go. So far, so good. The organization's thriving, not thriving so well in the COVID environment of fundraising, but certainly doing some really important work. And, we stuck to it.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is that, you identified a problem and you kind of, I guess for me, like, I think about that word founder and how much ego can be in it, as you said. It's like what you've described is kind of being a catalyst for something to happen, and then being clear that it wasn't about you kind of taking it all the way, or So I think there's probably like there's something in the way that we think about what it means to found something and the ego attached to that. That's probably, part of what's problematic, sometimes.
Very. And catalyst is a really good way of thinking of it. I think it's sort of sparking the change and then trying as soon as possible to not be the person that's in charge of it. That's a very difficult thing to do. And there's a lot of learning. I don't want to say learnings because I believe that's not a word, but there's a lot of lessons. Thank you. There's a lot of lessons in that process that I learned the first time that would mean that the second time around it will be much quicker and smoother.
Are you planning to found something else then?
Well, I'm up to number 5 now. I mean, I don't wear that as a badge of honor. It's just sort of what's happened. So not anytime soon. I need to de-found stuff as opposed to found more things. I think one of the things about founding organizations in my experience is it is on the basis of privilege. And we talked about the idea of ceding power. So, using your privilege maybe to open a door or to initiate something, and then giving the people that are not used to the power the opportunity to run with it. I think people sometimes ask or think about, like, why wasn't OIC Cambodia started by a Cambodian person, potentially the director there now, and if it's such an obvious thing. And I think part of the answer is because it's to do with privilege. I was able to start it because if it goes belly up, I just get on a plane and go back to Australia and get a job, or move back in with the parents. And I have more financial security than the average Cambodian, even though I'm not wealthy by any stretch of the imagination in a Western sense. But I certainly have more reserves than the average Cambodian person does usually have. So a lot of this is really about money, and ability to take those chances and take those risks. The average person can't do it. And I also mentioned at the beginning, I'm the youngest of 3 siblings, and statistically, youngest kids are the most risk-taking. So potentially, you could line it up with that too.
Right. And I think what we were saying before, like, one way that we can think about using our privilege might be to do those things, to be a catalyst for something, and then as long as we can stay conscious of not being attached, as you said before, to like the label of or the ego that might go along with that, right?
Yeah, and that it's really hard to not get involved with how things are done, as we talked about, and particularly if the organization is being funded from a Western source, let's say, and maybe the Western charity that's funding it has liabilities to their registration or to the government. So sometimes you do have to step in and kind of go, actually, you can't do that, or we have to do it this way. But as much as possible, being able to take a step back from it and say, look, I wouldn't have done it like that, but as long as we get to where we think we're going to go, that's great. I have seen, other charities where the founder is, I'll be blunt, old and hobbling around, and kind of at that later stage of life, and everything is tied to this founder in terms of the way that they fundraise. It's, we're going to put this founder up in front of the camera, we're going to put the founder on the stage, and she or he's going to tell that story, and people are going to open their purses. And I always thought that was a very risky way of running an organization, because if something happens to me, or I get in trouble with the law, or I drunk drive or do something silly, which happens, potentially the knock-on effect is several hundreds, thousands of people are affected by that one dumb mistake. And I don't think that's fair on me or them. So that's another thing about this founder exit. It's sort of de-risking it as well.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Weh, for this conversation. I think people will find it really useful, and I wish you all the best with all of your work.
Thank you, Mary Ann. Yeah, it's a great conversation that you're having and starting, and I really appreciate the invite, and I'm really glad that we're talking about it.
Yeah. Take care.
Okay, take care.